I don't know if Dave gave you the introduction, but if he didn't, I'll quickly go through it. I'm a retired engineer. I'm a member of the Wisconsin Society Sons of the American Revolution for 31 years. I'm currently the color guard commander, but not dressed in that garb today. I'm dressed in the garb of my militia ancestor. On my business card, it says I'm a Revolutionary War historian, and nobody conferred that title on me, but that's what I call myself. I'm an author of several books and articles on the American Revolution and other topics. And I wanted to note that I use primary sources in all the things that I write about and speak about here today. I'm married. I have 12 grandchildren. Next slide. My book is a kind of a short book. It's only 78 pages long. There's a name index with 83 names and places in it. And then the units that I talk about in this book are a number of Albany militia regiments, the 4th Albany, commanded by Colonel Schermerhorn in Rensselaer-Wick, the 5th, it's Schuyler in Rensselaer-Wick, and so on, down to my guy who served in the 9th Albany in the Van Ness, Colonel Van Ness, East Claverack Regiment, and then the 10th Albany, which was in Livingston Manor, and finally the 17th Albany. My book is available on Amazon, and it's in a Kindle format or a soft cover, which you can order. It's $3 on Kindle and $5.99 for a hardcover plus shipping and handling. But I can mail you copies of that book for $7 plus shipping and handling. If you get a hold of me on my email at brianbarrett1@yahoo.com, then we can make a connection. Next slide. A little bit about my ancestor, Eleazar Barrett. He fought in the French and Indian War, and he was a farmer in western Massachusetts. He found some tillable soil in the Berkshire Mountains in the Green River Valley, and made his living farming. But there were a couple of times that he was a private in the Berkshire County militia and another time in the Albany County militia. At the time he served in this period I write about, he was 41 years old, but he had grown children at home who could manage the farm while he was away. He served 4 stints from 1776 and 1777, and all of the service was for short durations in the state of New York. He served on various war committees for his community, Alfred, Massachusetts, between 1778 and 1782. The format that I'd like to follow here today is a 20-minute presentation, unless Dave cuts me off. Questions and answers at the end. I like to have audience involvement, and I planted some questions throughout. Maybe we can hook up this technology so that the audience can be involved in my presentation. My wife, Mrs. Barrett, said I should always tell a joke. And since I've spoken to your group before, let's hope that I didn't tell you this joke before. I really don't have a lot of jokes, but this is what the 5th graders like. Why did Paul Revere ride a horse to Lexington in 1775? It's rhetorical. And the answer is he couldn't carry it. Next slide. The setting for my book is Eastern New York during the year 1776, early on in the American Revolution. And in the area that I'm talking about is in Berkshire and Albany County. where there were lots of so-called neutrals and Tories in the towns of Kinderhook, Claverack, and Albany. This was a hill country. Some people call them mountains. The Berkshire Mountains and the Taconic Mountains. That was between the Hudson River and the Massachusetts border, kind of north of Albany, or right around the Albany area. At the upper levels of governance, the New York congressional delegates to Congress were not extravagant in their enthusiasm for the American cause, and by that, they were wishy-washy as to which side they were going to land on. Remember, this was 1776, and it was before the American Revolution that I'm talking about right now. And I guess this is one of my questions for the group. Is there anyone in the group that had ancestors from Berkshire or Albany County? Now, I don't know if we can bring up anyone talking here. I don't see the speakers going off or the muting, so I'm not sure that I can even get any response from the audience. Dave, can you hear me, or can you unmute Dave? Don? Anyway, apparently we can't get the audio through. My last question I'd like to address here at this time is the rule of thirds. And for those of you that don't know what the rule of thirds, in 1776, and actually throughout the American Revolution, it was said that 1/3 of the population was on the side of the Patriots. The other third Tories, and then the other third were the neutrals. I have a screen up now that shows the area that's involved in my presentation here today. It's outlined in the dark lines there, and on the right you've got Massachusetts, the Massachusetts border, and then on the left we have the state of New York, and up in the far left corner there is Albany. And then the Hudson River kind of runs along the west border of the area that I'm talking about here today. But it shows the Kinderhook district, the Kings district, West Claverack, and East Claverack, and then the manor of Livingston down below. And then there's some communities over there in Massachusetts, Pittsfield, Stockbridge, and Alford. So a number of these characters that I talk about in my book are from the Massachusetts communities, and most of them that I talk about are from East Claverack district in New York. Next slide. A little bit about the political backdrop. There was a little confusion going on throughout the hierarchy of politics, but in Congress, there was a lot of tough talk going on. They, in Congress, had made a determination early on in 1776 that people that were giving intelligence to the enemy or supplying them with provisions were to be hung. Not so tough at the New York Provincial Convention, which was the governing body for the colony or state of New York at the time. They were a little softer, and they called a disaffected person someone who declared their willingness to take an oath to neither directly or indirectly do or say anything inimical to the American cause, but would not swear an oath of allegiance. Now, that's a lot of gobbledygook and word salad, but it suggests that they weren't going to be too tough. But then there were patriots, a lot of them in Berkshire County and in the eastern part of Albany County that were tough. They said a Tory was a man whose head was in England, whose body was in America, and whose neck ought to be stretched. So that characterizes some of the attitudes that existed in the ranks of the militia at the leadership level, officer level, and at the enlisted level. Hangings for treason, though, were rare. We kind of only recognized Andre, and he was on the other side. But it's pretty hard to find instances of where the Patriots hung somebody for treason. And back to the rule of thirds. You didn't want to rile people up because you very easily could get on the wrong side of 2/3 of the population. Remember that a lot of them were loyal to the crown, and then there were the neutrals who could step over to the other side pretty easy. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. As far as the social backdrop for my book, we've talked a little bit about mixed loyalties in the society, pretty prevalent. And that included families. You've all recognized that within a family, you could have somebody on either side of the conflict. And certainly there were neighbors and members of the church, all could be on either side there. So there were mixed loyalties in society. And at the time of my writing, city officials in Albany, including the mayor, were actually jailed for loyalty to the king. So they were replaced, of course, by patriots. And at the time, in 1776, Albany militia regiments themselves were infested with Tories. They couldn't be relied on to stand up because they didn't swear an oath of allegiance. Spying was prevalent and known to many that it was going on. The Tories were counting men all the time and figuring out the movements of the groups. And there was open recruitment of residents, men for Royal Ranger companies. Next slide. There's the old Albany jail on the left side there. That was the courthouse, and then the barracks, the main building in the middle was the barracks for the the New York provincials from the Albany area. And then you've got a little exercise area out in the back. The prison was in the basement, and the prisoner, you can see a couple of them there in a small print walking around, and out in front, of course, all of the patriots. This is a rendering from 1800, but things were much the same back in 1776. Next slide. As far as the legal backdrop for my book, Congress in June of 1776 enacted what they called an oath of association, whereby people were to separate the wheat from the chaff by swearing an oath of association with the Continental Congress. Congress delegated down to local groups, local committees in each community to enforce that oath. And what that meant is somebody had to go around and swear the oath of all the residents and mark them down on a piece of paper as to which side they stood on, which one of the thirds they belonged to. In Albany County, they had a committee that was made up of pretty tough hombres. They were judge and jury. They kept copious minutes of everything they did through the period of 1776 through 1778, and it was a source, an invaluable source to me, to find out who was who and what these people were up to in terms of raids and punishments and so forth. In Berkshire County, they were also tough, and they closed the courts in 1774. They just didn't want to have anything to do with the king's courts, and they primarily used the sheriff to to do enforcement and chase down the Tories that were in the county, and also the ones that crossed over from Albany and sought refuge from the Albany Committee in Berkshire County. The typical punishments, which I talk about extensively in my book, were fines, parole, and jail. And you'll notice it says nothing about hanging there. Fines were made for people who had the money. Parole was a form of house arrest where the residents could not leave their premises or their farms, but they were allowed to go out and farm and, and fetch things from the store. And jail was the last resort for the toughest of the hombres. The policemen at the time were the Albany militia units and what they called rangers. And rangers, that's again a rhetorical question. I wish I could get a little input from people in the crowd. But rangers were guys they lived off the land and they were under the employ generally of the province. So New York would have hired rangers to go out and flush out the wheat from the chaff. In terms of religion played an important role in the way people thought and behaved. And there was a guy named Reverend Thomas Allen from Pittsfield who in 1774 had already started in on the Tories. And he noted that the poor Tories at Kinderhook are mortified and grieved and are wheeling about and beginning to take the quick step. What he meant by that was that in 1774, they were already getting the message and leaving for territories that were more friendly to Tories. And he highlighted Kinderhook as being where there were a nest of these Tories. And he gave sermons. He crossed over the border into Albany County and went right into their backyard and started and criticized them at their location. Later on, when the British were coming down from Canada, he prayed that the Lord would teach patriot fingers to pull the trigger, because there were a lot of them that were not willing to pull the trigger. And so that was one of his sermons. On the other side of the coin, we had the Tory Reverend Swartfeger from Albany County. He was a little bit north of Albany, and he actually recruited men to fight for the king. And he led a small group at one point against patriots and was eventually arrested. Next slide. Can we get the next slide, please? Oh, there we go. Kind of shows the setting that might have existed. It's a sketch of a church, and there's the Reverend Thomas up in the pulpit, and the patriots swinging the swords over there at the Tories on the other side of the aisle. It's characteristic of what might have happened in many of the churches at that time. Next slide. Here's the conflicts that I discuss at length and in detail. There was an uprising in the King's District in May of 1776 that drew trusted militia out of Massachusetts rather than militia out of New York. They trusted the militia of Massachusetts to come in and enforce the oath. There was also an uprising in a place called Taconic, which was south, almost in Dutchess County, south of the Manor of Livingston in May of 1776. And in that, there were a number of skirmishes. A couple of Tories were killed in that skirmish. wasn't often that they actually killed, but if they fired first, it didn't take long for the Patriots to open up fire. Then there was something called the outrage in Livingston Manor in June of 1776, where the Tories firebombed the home of a sergeant of the manor's militia unit. In Albany, officials were still being arrested, mostly men that served on the various committees around the area, and they were being hauled off in jail. They had to take the Albany city officials out of the jail because they were threatening to storm the jail. And they sent them down to Kingston and over into Litchfield in Connecticut and eventually down to Hartford in Connecticut to get them far afield from the Tories. Then there were, I talk about a provincial ranger company that was hired and paid for by the New York Provincial Convention. And they were quite active in the setting of my book, and probably the main force that did the arresting of Tories who wouldn't swear an oath. Kinderhook officials, right to the very end, held on to their loyalty to the king, and eventually they had to be expelled and arrested and jailed. I talk about raids by Albany militiamen in both the Kinderhook and King's districts, and then in Livingston Manor. And my ancestor was very much a part of those raids in Kinderhook and King's district. I just want to conclude at this point. I was given 20 minutes. I think I'm running over a little bit here, but blame it on technical difficulties. Anyway, the militia played an important role to curtail the treachery in Albany County. If they had not acted, it would have got worse. And one of the things that, if you read my book, I hope you conclude that officials learned a valuable lesson in cross-border cooperation. There were deep-seated hostilities between New York and Massachusetts officials, but they set them aside for the common good, in this case, to keep Tories in check. Tories were purged from all the governing committees and offices in Albany County, and there were a lot of them. And that helped set the stage for what was to come in 1777. You couldn't have the enemy within and fight a successful war. My last joke, if you want to call it that, is in the form of a question. What was Washington's favorite tree? And some of these guys down there in Luathahoochee might know this. I might have used this one on you before. His favorite tree was the infantry. What else? That concludes my presentation. Thank you.